right, well, we welcome you back to this new session, and we're going to be covering the botanical medicines during this time. And Brother Al very graciously said that I could take a little more time if I needed it to cover this subject. Now, herein, I would like to state that I can't hear you. 15 minutes? 50 minutes, okay, all right. I'm not in this hour going to try to go over all the diseases and the herbs you use for them, although I have all of that in a program. And I'm happy if there's some way that we can share that information, but I believe it would be helpful in starting. Maybe we can talk a little bit about some of that tomorrow, if the Lord allows us to be here. But I believe that the church needs to have a foundation that it can rest on as to why we would use the botanicals in contrast to the pharmaceuticals. Because wherever you go teaching, you're going to run into this. People are going to be really coming at you, talking about your unbalanced stand using weeds and seeds. Okay? And if you're sick, you need strong medicine and scientific medicine and so forth. And if we don't know what the Lord says, we can become confused by some of the medical experts. That's what we call them, the medical experts. But I believe that we have the greatest physician among us who ever lived. And I think we can listen to what he has to say, and we can accept his counsel over that of the medical experts of the world, whether they be in the world or even among some of us. So, let's again begin with prayer, can we? Oh, Father, please come once again and bathe us in your Spirit. Enlighten us by your word. May your words of truth guide us today through this last hour where there are so many traps set for our feet. May we be able to receive and appreciate the light and then walk in the light and rejoice in the light for Jesus' sake. Amen. I'm going to give you just a little bit of information from some of the literature which should help us, and then we're going to go to the Bible, and then we'll go to the Spirit of Prophecy, and we'll see. These are some statistics that I gathered here recently for one of our talks at our Georgia Cumberland camp meeting. Each year, more than 60 million Americans use herbal remedies and other types of alternative medical care. In fact, more people seek help from alternative health care providers than from conventional health care practitioners. Perhaps most telling of all, nearly 3 out of 4 patients who use alternative medicines will never tell their doctors about it. Why? They don't want to hear about it. They don't want to be ridiculed, right? And told that they're foolish and so forth. So they just don't tell them. And you know, there is a truth to that. You don't cast your pearls before swine. They'll just turn and rend you. So why do that? Why create a controversy? Now that quotation was from the Guide to Herbal Medicines 2000 by Fetro and Avila. These are just from some books that are out in the literature now. This is from now, I thought, a very revealing and reputable source. You know, the PDR, the physician's desk reference, you know, they have it for pharmaceutical agents. Well, this is the PDR that's put out for herbal medicine. And this is by Dr. and MD David Heber. This was 2004, and this is what he says in the introduction. According to the World Health Organization, 4 billion people, amounting to 80% of the world's population, use herbal medicine for some aspect of their primary health care. So, brothers and sisters, we're not in the minority. Okay. Now, the practitioners may want to make us think we are, but they're the ones that are so bitterly opposing this. Okay. But the people are moving ahead. Yes, ma'am. You would hope they would be able to, but let me share with you some statements here. This Dr. Heber is a PhD, MD. He's professor of medicine and public health at the School of Medicine, UCLA in Los Angeles, California. He goes on, and he has some interesting statements here. In view of their preventive benefits and potential lack of toxicity when they are properly used, I view the botanicals as the medicines of the 21st century. And I predict that they will ultimately be used for the prevention and the treatment of many modern chronic diseases of aging. Isn't that amazing? He continues, today we are rediscovering the utility of herbal medicine as botanical dietary supplements with potentially important preventive and medicinal effects. However, when patients talk about using herbal medicines, primary care physicians often lack the knowledge to provide intelligent advice for their use or their misuse. Okay. Now, this isn't coming from some herbalist. This is coming from an MD, a professor of medicine, and from the School of Public Health, UCLA University School of Medicine. Now, I believe that without a question, herbal medicine is here to stay. Despite the opposition that you may encounter from the regular medical practitioners. What we need is additional training for our traditional practitioners in order to fill the knowledge gap, because as doctors and nurses, we're not given this kind of knowledge in medical school or nursing school most of the time. We just don't have it, and so when we come out, we don't know. And so anything we don't know, it's kind of a little unsettling. And we don't want to be telling people to do something that we don't know anything about, right? And so you can understand the reluctance of the regular medical physicians to just jump on board, but we need an educational system to try to help them, right? Not to criticize them and not to condemn them, but to try to work with them and bring them up to the 21st century. Now, the question is, if over 80 billion people, 80% of the Earth's population, are using some herbal medicine as part of their healthcare program, why is it? Why are we seeing such a ground swell among the people to use botanical medicine? I believe there are reasons. Many people have lost faith in mainstream medicine, especially if it has failed them in overcoming disease or if they have been harmed by the medical therapies. Secondly, there are simple economics involved. In many cases, people now can't afford to pay for conventional health care. It's outpriced itself on the market. And you can see what's going on in our own country in terms of how are we going to deal with this. And so everybody has a plan, the health reform. Many people, number 3, are coming to believe that anything natural is inherently safer or better than a treatment produced in a lab or a high-speed, high-tech manufacturing facility. This is some of the mindset. I'm not saying it's true, it's false, but this is what people are beginning to think. Another good reason, I believe, is that the herbal industry itself has developed a high profile here in the United States and in the other civilized nations. Many developing countries, through advertisements of their herbal products on television, in magazines, newspapers, and on the internet now. If you just get on the internet and you go to any disease, type it in, put natural treatment, and you'll just come up with hit after hit on what you can do naturally to treat disease. Finally, though, and this is my own personal belief, and I'm just going to share it with you, you don't have to agree, but I believe that God Himself is at work, and He is going to exalt His system of healing, not through manufactured drugs, but through nature and natural remedies. I believe that God is doing this. You remember that Jesus made a statement. Every plant that was not planted by my Heavenly Father is going to be rooted up. And before He returns to this earth, God, I believe, is going to do it. And He is going to show the foolishness of every plan that is not rooted and grounded in God. Let's look at some of the biblical support for the use of herbs. Genesis 1:11, God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth." And it was so. So where did the herb come from? Where did the plants come from? From the earth, from the Creator. He made these. You remember the statement? I shared it, I believe, Friday or whatever, about God had, through His own agencies, created things to be used in His healing program. God created them, not man. Agencies to be used, and the herbs are from the Creator's hands. We're to use them for food, Genesis 1:29, I have given you every herb-bearing seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, every tree in which is the fruit of the tree yielding seed, to you it shall be for meat or food. So the plants are to be used for food. That's what God's original intention was. The animals were not put here for food originally. Okay? Very clear from the Bible. Psalms 104:14, He causeth the grass to grow for the cattle, and the herb for the service of man, that he may bring forth food out of the earth, and so forth. So in any way that these plants can be used to man's service, God has ordained it, right? Medicine, food, we use the herbs in other ways. You can see we use them for dyes, we use them for different articles that we use, rope making, right? We use it for wood, do we not? To burn, to keep us warm. We use it, I believe that this was an herb at one time, wasn't it? Right? Yeah, sure. For the service of man. For healing, 2 Kings 20, verse 7. This is for King Hezekiah. You remember the story of Hezekiah. Now this man was so sick he was going to die. You remember that story. And he turned his face to the wall because Isaiah the prophet was sent to him to tell him, King Hezekiah, you're going to die. Get your house in order. And Hezekiah wept. He turned his face to the wall. And I believe that there is a message even in that for us. The message is coming. We're going to perish unless we repent. And we should turn our face to the wall and begin to weep and to plead with the Lord. Take my sins from me. Take my sins away. And in this matter, God heard Hezekiah's prayer. He wasn't haughty. He was humbled. And he pleaded with the Lord for mercy, and the Lord heard his prayer. Isaiah was not even out of the courtyard of the palace until the message came to Isaiah, go back and you tell the king, I've given him 15 extra years. And he didn't just stop there. The verse 7 says, Isaiah said, take a lump of figs. And they took and they laid it on the boil, and Hezekiah recovered. This man had a terminal illness. He was going to die. And a lump of figs was placed there, and the man recovered. So we have biblical evidence. Jesus, the way he worked, he used various methods of healing, didn't he? He used the clay, the spittle, He touched one. He spoke a word. He used the water. All of these natural things. The prophets. It was interesting to me. You remember when, in the apostles, you remember when these people would die, they would often stretch themselves over the body and breathe their life into them. You remember? How many here are familiar with CPR? A little different, but it's kind of similar. And remember, Eutychus fell out of the window and Paul went down, stretched himself over that, warmed his body, breathed into him. Eutychus came to life. No, there is power in the life of Christ to resurrect, isn't there? There is power. God's green pharmacy, beyond man's comprehension. I want to just share a few other statements. This is from The book, The Green Pharmacy by James Duke, sorry. James is on my mind. James Duke. Duke's his PhD. He was with the U.S. Department of Agricultural Service for years and has written extensively on these plant substances. He says there are some 300,000 higher plant species that are all chemically distinct, but fewer than 10% of them have been carefully screened for either their medicinal or their toxic constituents. 300,000 that we know about, and less than 10% have even been studied. A really good herbalist might know between 1,000 and 2,000 species, but rarely would they know more. And how many are there? 300,000. I wanted to just read to you a little bit of our counsels that we are given as a people. And do you notice how God doesn't contradict Himself? Have you noticed that? Because if God is moving a people, He will give them biblical counsel. He will give them the inspired counsels from the testimonies, and He will give them true science. And they will all move in the same direction. All will line up, and then God's people, there's a church, can move. And I believe the church is moving. The church is moving. Not everybody in the church is going to move, but the church is moving. Second Selected Messages, page 279. There are simple herbs and roots that every family may use for themselves and need not call a physician any sooner than they would call a lawyer. Okay? The Lord has provided antidotes for disease in simple plants. And these can be used by faith with no denial of faith. For by using the blessings that God has provided for our benefit, we cooperate with God. And that's what we want to do, isn't it? Cooperate with God. Second Selected Messages, again, 289. This is from Loma Linda Messages, page 316. There are many simple herbs which, if our nurses would learn the value of, they could use them in the place of drugs and find them very effective. By the way, Loma Linda Messages, who is that directed to? Well, it's to the church, but specifically to those at our sanitarium and school there, and then later our medical college, in terms of trying to direct that school as to how God wanted to treat the sick. And we've read these statements, I believe, before. It would have been better if from the very first drugs had been kept out of our sanitariums and use had been made of such simple remedies as are found in pure water, pure air, sunlight, and some of the simple herbs that are growing in the field. These would be just as efficacious as the drugs that are now used under mysterious names and concocted by human science. And they would leave no injurious effects in the system. That was Second Selected Messages, page 291. And you remember from our earlier talks together, what causes more deaths among humanity than all other causes combined? Drug medications. And even humanity recognizes, they say, they're somewhere between the 4th and the 6th leading cause of death, and that was back in the 90s. And since that time, the adverse reactions and deaths is just escalating. Now, I'm not going to bother you and burden you with how far back the use of herbs go, but at some point, if you want to see, they'll go back to the beginning of civilization. And we have recorded incidences all along the way. Did you know even during the Dark Ages that in the monasteries in Europe they were using the herbs? I found that very interesting. All these, you know, we've traced prophecy, at least from Babylon, haven't we, all the way to the end when the Lord comes? And in every one of those nations, Babylon, Greece, Medo-Persia, all of them, all using botanical agents. And these were heathen nations. What about today? Many of the synthetic medicines, not all, not the majority, but many, owe their existence to naturally occurring herbs, plants, and trees. For instance, aspirin comes from a change, obviously, of the phytochemical, but from white willow bark. Quinine from the cinchona tree in Peru. Digitalis from the foxglove plant. Vinblastin, a chemotherapeutic agent from vinca, the vinca plant, periwinkle. Taxotere, another chemotherapeutic agent from the Pacific, Western Pacific yew, H-E-W. You'll find herbal therapy being used today in Chinese traditional medicine, Native American medicine, osteopathy, naturopathy, Ayurvedic medicine from India. And today in this country we have the complementary and alternative medicines. You know, we have that as a separate department at the National Institutes of Health, NIH. We have a whole separate department that are using and experimenting with these botanical medicines. Now they're using a lot of other things too that we would never use because they don't have the light that we have. A lot of them are spurious. They're brought in under another spirit. I believe there is a pressing need for this resurgence in herbal medicine. And why? Well, we've talked about an ever-escalating incidence of serious adverse drug events. And I'd like just to share some of this information with you. Now, we've talked about Bible, haven't we? We've looked at Spirit of Prophecy councils. We know the warnings that the prophet gave us about drug therapy. Now I want to show you from medical literature itself the cry of alarm at what is happening with drug medications. I'm going to give you this statement. Second selected message, page 450. More deaths have been caused by drug taking than from all other causes combined. If there was in the land one physician in the place of thousands, a vast amount of premature mortality would be prevented. Multitudes of physicians and multitudes of drugs have cursed the inhabitants of this earth and have carried thousands and tens of thousands to untimely graves. Now, is this true today? I have had the privilege of carrying these messages to many places, to different groups, to some of the medical communities. And because our physicians and the physicians of the world aren't trained this way, it seems like a strange message to them. Very strange. And it's hard for us as physicians to really appreciate this. But let's examine carefully the medical literature. In the Western world, in the United States and in Europe, There's been a shift away from the use of natural botanical medicines to the synthetic drugs, especially during the last 20th century. There was a reason for that. Cited reasons, well, we can have better standardization. We can have enhanced potency, ease of administration, widespread availability. And then, of course, there's the economic interest, the lobbying interest in Washington that are pushing for their drug medications. Has this resulted in the blessing that we had hoped for? In 1994, I think we mentioned this, and I'm just going to review this, and then I'm going to get up to remember I gave some statistics, and I told you I was going to take you up to 2008 or 9. Back in 1994, you remember over 2 million hospitalized patients had serious adverse drug effects, and 106,000 of these lost their lives. This made adverse drug events reported by the Journal of American Medical Association 1998 as causing somewhere between the 4th and 6th leading cause of death in the United States. It was reported as between the 4th and the 6th leading cause of death. That was the mid-90s. And you remember that didn't include adverse drug effects that were occurring outside of the hospital, from patients taking prescription medicines from the doctor's office, from the clinics, over-the-counter drug medication. I reported to you that article in U.S. Today, December 1998, that in 1997, the earlier year, just from one class of drugs, over-the-counter, NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, that over 16,500 Americans died from gastrointestinal hemorrhages in that 1 year, from over-the-counter medication. Is our government silent about these things? No, they are speaking. What do the health agencies say? This is from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, 1999. Adverse drug events occurring in hospitalized patients in the United States result in more than 770,000 injuries and deaths each year and cost per capita every hospital in this country $5.6 million just to take care of the adverse drug effects. This estimate of cost does not include adverse drug effects that caused admissions to the hospital. Malpractice and litigation cost are cost of injuries to the patients. National hospital expenses to treat patients who suffer from adverse drug effects during hospitalizations are estimated to be up to $5.6 billion annually. That's just in the hospitals. Now that is given in the best picture, where you've got doctors prescribing, nurses giving, and observing patients. And this isn't just mistakes and mishaps. These are side effects of medications. Okay? That was in 1999. I'm going to jump to 2005. This is from the Research on Adverse Drug Events and Reports Project. It's called RADAR. Reported that adverse drug and device reactions are accounting for as many as 100,000 deaths annually here in the United States. And that's just from what is reported. Okay, and I'll get into that in just a minute in terms of what is the estimated reporting rate of adverse drug effects. In general, more than half of the most serious adverse drug reactions were discovered 7 or more years after the drug was marketed. Okay? In other words, when you think, well, it's gone through trials and all of that, so it's safe. No. More than half of the most serious drug reactions were reported 7 or more years after the drug had been on the market, released. That was from the American Medical Association Journal, May 4, 2005. 2006, what about antibiotics? No problems, right? There was an article written in The Consultant magazine, it's for physicians, volume 46, number 10, September 1, 2006. And the article was called, "What Hath Antibiotics Wrought?" The answer, the nightmare of Clostridium difficile colitis. Dr. Gregory Rutecki, professor of medicine at Ohio State University in Columbus, stated in this article in Consultant that with the ever-increasing use of broad-spectrum antibiotics here in the United States, there has been an equally escalating appearance of severe bacterial colitis, Clostridium difficile, which may result in either total colectomies for patients, they have to take the whole colon, or sepsis, bacteria invading the bloodstream, and death. Sounding the voice of alarm, Dr. Rutecki goes on to state that not only are the incidence, severity, and the expense of C. difficile infection on the rise, but the newer antibiotics used with ever-increasing frequency have created an even more resistant super strain of Clostridium difficile. And so when you're killing off all the other bacteria, and these strains are resistant to the antibiotic themselves, they're going to replicate and produce this toxic enterocolitis. At the time of the writing of Dr. Rutecki's article, the mean cost of treating this infection was about $10,970 per patient to treat this infection, because they have to hospitalize them usually. They're treated with vancomycin, which is a very expensive drug, all of the nursing care that's involved. Resultant healthcare cost for treating C. difficile was estimated to exceed in this country more than $1 billion a year, just from the side effects, one side effect of antibiotic use. And so his recommendation regarding the best course of action to take to reduce the incidence of this serious healthcare complication: antibiotic stewardship with restraint in the use of epidemiologically implicated antibiotics, usually the second and third generation, and these were the class of drugs. Second and third generation cephalosporins, those would be agents like we commonly see, cephalexin, Keflex, you know, some of these that are given so widely for routine infections. Clindamycin, and the newer fluoroquinolones like ciprofloxacin, norfloxacin, you know, those agents. Let's go to the year 2007. This review was published in the Archives of Internal Medicine, 2007, and it reported a study period 1998 to 2005. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration has operated the adverse event reporting system since 1998. It collects all voluntary reports from adverse drug events submitted directly to the agency or through drug manufacturers. Now that's already a bias, isn't it? Okay. And it's estimated, I believe, that probably, what is it, about anywhere from 1 to 10% of the adverse reactions are being reported through those agencies, from 1 to 10%. That means about 90% are never reported. But of those that are reported, we're looking at those, okay? From 1998 through 2005, in that time period were reported serious adverse drug events that had increased 2.6-fold over that time period, and fatal adverse drug events had increased 2.7-fold from 5,519 individuals to 15,107 people from the beginning of that period to the end of that period. When it started reporting, what? About 5,000 people? To the end, 15,000 each year. So what does that tell us about the seriousness of the drugs that are being used? You're getting an ever-escalating death rate, okay, from these drugs. Reported serious events increased 4 times faster than the growth in the total number of outpatient prescriptions written. Now that's interesting if you think about it. The drug events themselves increasing 4 times faster than the number of prescriptions that were being written. Think about that. These data show a marked increase in reported deaths and serious injuries associated with drug therapy over the study period. The results highlight the importance of this public health problem and illustrate the need for improved systems to manage the risk of prescription drugs. Now, the conclusions of this article were very interesting. Not all adverse reactions to new drugs can be anticipated or avoided under the present system, according to medical experts. It's just not possible for us to know ahead of time. Secondly, it's simply not possible to identify all the adverse effects before they're marketed. And thirdly, over 51% of the approved drugs had serious side effects not detected prior to their release. Over half. Now this is from the Archives of Internal Medicine. Use of painkillers, 2007. I'm just going to show you a picture, okay? Can you see this bar graph? What's happening on the bars? They're increasing. This is from the year 1991 to the year 2007. And this is the reported incidence of fatalities from the use of narcotic medications. Okay? Pardon me? That's what they know about. That's correct. That's what they know about. Now I want to go to 2008. That was last year, right? 2008. This data was released from the Institute for Safe Medicine Practices during the first quarter of 2008. That's the first 3 months. There were 20,745 adverse drug reactions reported to the federal, the FDA, Drug Administration. That was up 38% from the previous year. Of these, 4,824 resulted in the death of the individuals involved. That was just in 3 months. Assuming at best a 10% reporting rate to the FDA, that would then mean that an estimated 192,000 Americans will lose their life each year from taking a pharmaceutical drug medication. If we use a higher estimate of reporting, a lower estimate. Let's say, we're saying from 1 to 10% are reported. And I gave you the statistics for if 10% of the cases were reported. Let's say that it wasn't 10%. Let's say it was less than that. Let's go to the other end and just look if it was 1% that was reported. The estimated death rate from pharmaceuticals then would be approximately 77% of all the reported deaths. Now, that is statistics that would be more in keeping with what our prophet told us, that more deaths are caused from drug medication than all other causes combined. Well, we're going to stop here because it's just something for us to be warned about, reflect upon, because you're going to hear this in your efforts to take God's simple messages. You're going to hear this repeatedly. I know because I do all the time. Well, drugs today are safer than those drugs that were talked about in the old days. We've got high tech now. We've really explored these drugs, and we know they're safer. Don't you buy into that. Listen to what God says, and you'll be saved a lot of pain and suffering. Okay? Now, it doesn't mean, again, I want to tell you, it doesn't mean that we never take a drug. It doesn't mean that. Because we are maybe in the infancy of understanding how to treat some of these diseases. And if you've got a life-threatening situation, you've got an emergent measure, we may feel impressed to give a drug medication to save a life, to buy a little time. But at the same time, we don't want to just embrace drug medication as a friend and say there's no problem with it, because we know that that's not true. We should always be trying to ask the Lord, how can we use your agencies in a safer way? And even if we have to use a drug, to get that person off that drug as soon as we possibly can, and find then the safer alternative to continue them on. Right? That makes sense? Okay. Do we have time for questions, or are we about out? 1 minute? 2 questions. Yes, ma'am.
Should it be that no one should sleep in the basement environment at any given time?
The question is, should we in our living quarters live in basements? And I would say my opinion is that's not the best, because that's usually the most damp part of any dwelling is the basement. And it's not usually accessible to sunlight. You may get some air down there, but it's not usually accessible to sunlight. And that's where you will see mostly the molds, the mildews, and those things really coming in. It's damp. And I would not think it's the best. We weren't really made to live underground. Let the moles do that, right? There was another question. Not in 1 minute. The question was about vaccinations. There are some concerns about vaccinations. Our church has not taken any stand against vaccinations. You'll know, I'm sure you do, that the number of vaccinations that we are now in this country recommending children to take is just escalating. I mean, it's amazing. I was reading an article recently about this, and it's not just MMR now. I mean, you've just got all kinds of things that we're vaccinating people with, children. And so I think we should be cautious. We should be balanced. You know, if kids are in school and they're crowded into conditions where there's a lot of infectious diseases, I would never tell parents, oh, you should never vaccinate your children. On the other hand, I would give parents every liberty to make that decision based upon how they want to rear their children. If they are homeschooling their children and they have them away from all of this mass, education, and even if they're just living a healthful lifestyle, they're teaching their children, they're giving them good hygiene at home, they may not be so inclined to want to give these vaccinations that have various substances such as trace amounts of mercury and other things as preservatives in them. But I think we should, the church has not taken a stand against vaccination, and I don't think we should do that, but at the same time give people the liberty to make decisions. And I know at least in our state, if a parent doesn't want their children vaccinated, they still have the privilege of coming to the physician, and the physician can write a note that says that the parents, either for religious purposes or whatever, they don't want their children vaccinated. Now, you're going to be called fanatical if you do that. And I'm not here to defend it one way or the other. There's pros and cons, but I think that even if we vaccinate, we ought to be temperate with this. We shouldn't just go along with all of these escalating numbers of vaccinations that we're trying to give to the children. I think we've become a little bit too heavy on that end now. That's my own personal opinion, but everyone's entitled to an opinion.